Welcome to this second lecture on evolution and strategy. In this lecture, we'll be discussing family conflict and cooperation and how those relate to fitness and natural selection. There's a number of questions we'll be addressing in this lecture. Why does natural selection cause conflict between offspring and their parents? Can being helpful have a genetic basis? Do we see evolutionary reasons for being helpful? We'll also think about, do animals demonstrate altruistic behavior? And why do bees get others to reproduce on their behalf? How does that increase their fitness? We'll be thinking about eusocial insects and other species. So to start off with, let's think about a few different things to do with family conflict. Competition between siblings for resources, such as whether they have the biggest egg compared to their peers, to their siblings, how much milk they're getting, how much they're being fed by the parents, that competition reduces each of the siblings' fitness. So natural selection, from the point of view of the offspring, will result in a couple of selection pressures. Denying siblings food in order to gain more for themselves is beneficial. Extracting as many resources as possible from the mother is also beneficial. So genes that code for these two character traits are more likely to be passed on to the offspring because they're going to increase the fitness of that intermediate generation. Offspring that have these genes are more likely themselves to survive and pass on those genes to the next generation. So we'd expect the frequency of alleles that code for these two particular behaviors, denying siblings food to gain more for themselves and extracting as many resources from the mother as possible, those would increase in frequency within a population. It's important to understand here that parents and offspring are going to have slightly different viewpoints on this. A mother's fitness is the number of offspring that she has that survive and reproduce. But the offspring's fitness is different. It is its ability to survive and reproduce. Now, that may include the survival of the parent and siblings, but that is not as important as the offspring's own survival in determining that offspring's fitness. So here we have a difference between optimal strategies for the mother and fitness is going to result in optimal strategies being different because they have different viewpoints. This can create intergenerational conflict. What is better for the mother is not necessarily always the same thing that is better for the offspring. We can think about this from the viewpoint of a gene through selfish gene theory. Modern evolutionary theory considers the viewpoint of genes. It considers how does each gene cause its own replication in future generations. A gene that promotes its own survival via natural selection will become more prevalent within a wider population, and so will increase in frequency. Of course, counter to that, a gene that causes an individual to be less likely to survive is going to become less common within a population. In a family, different genes are shared. Remember, 50% of each offspring's genes are from each parent. You get half your genes from your mum and half from your dad. And siblings share approximately 50% of their genes with one another, if they have both of the same parents, that is. So there is some sharing of genes between individuals within family members, and we can think about this in terms of, the more closely related are going to share more genes with one another. The more distantly related, right, you share fewer genes with your cousins and even fewer with your second cousins, etc. We can give this a value. This genetic relatedness can be calculated as the coefficient of relatedness, or R. Self has an R value of 1. If you have a gene, there is a 100% chance that you have that gene. Parents and siblings have an R value of 0.5. If you have a gene in your body, there is a 50% chance that that same gene is shared by your parent, by one of your parents, by each of them individually. Siblings have an R value of 0.5. because, like you, they got half of their genes from each of their parents, so on average you will share half of your genes with each of your siblings. Given selfish gene theory, this means that selection is stronger to aid self rather than aiding parents or siblings because of this coefficient of relatedness. Any gene that promotes its own survival within an individual is going to have a stronger selection pressure than promoting the survival of its siblings. One way we can look at that is, one example of this is in the cost-benefit ratio of milk production in mammals. We can look at the dichotomy, the difference in viewpoint of the mother and offspring. Selection acts to maximize the cost-to-benefit ratio. What is the best compromise between the two for the individual? So, from the point of view of the mother and the offspring, there is the same cost and the same benefit. The cost is that producing more milk impacts the mother's chances of survival and future reproduction. But there is a benefit to both the mother and the offspring. The benefit is that the offspring is going to survive and go on to reproduce itself. From the mother's perspective, the cost and the benefit are different in terms of how they are weighed. We can look at this through the R value, through the lens of the R value. The mother's survival is the most important thing to the mother because she has an R value of 1. Her survival and future reproduction matters more greatly than each individual offspring's survival and reproduction. That does matter, but because each individual offspring has an R value of just 0.5 to her, it is less important. The offspring, however, because it's got an R value of 0.5 with its mother, it and an R value of 1 with itself, there is a greater benefit in the offspring for getting more milk from the mother and maybe kind of risking a little bit more the mother's survival. The compromise point is different between the two individuals. The mothers would naturally incline to produce slightly less milk in order to protect herself. The offspring is willing to risk that a little bit more and so would want the mother to be producing slightly more milk. For both, there is a bias, an inbuilt evolutionary bias towards being selfish. And that bias would be selected for. Individuals that have that correct bias towards themselves, as it were, are more likely to survive and pass that bias on to their offspring. So, do we have any other examples? Well, actually, we've got a good one in people, in humans, with placental wars. So, when babies are developing in their mother's uterus, they secrete factors, the embryo secretes factors to make the placenta bigger so that it gets more nutrients from the mother. Remember, the placenta is how the baby gains nutrients from the mother. The larger the placenta, the more nutrients it gets. Other factors produced by the mother inhibit the growth of the placenta so that not too many of the mother's nutrients are taken. Here we can see that these slightly different desires of the two individuals in order to optimize their own fitness run counter to one another. Natural selection of both counters the other in most cases, and so most offspring produce an intermediate-sized placenta. However, sometimes there's an imbalance. Maybe the baby doesn't produce enough of the factors, in which case the placenta can be too small, and that can lead to miscarriage. Or the mother doesn't produce any of the factors that counter the growth of the placenta, so the placenta becomes too big, and that can risk the health of the mother, and that can damage the health of the mother. We see examples of this when offspring are older too, in what are sometimes referred to as the weaning wars. The offspring want to maintain parental support for as long as possible. Here we can see that this joey, which is clearly big enough to hop around on its own, is still using the mother to carry that individual around, carry the joey around. That is better for the joey, Okay, it's beneficial, it's saving energy, but it's detrimental to the mother. The offspring want to maintain that parental support for as long as possible, but the optimal point for when the jury shouldn't be getting back in the mother, or when the jury shouldn't be, when the individual, let's say, if it's um, another mammal, not producing milk, is going to be different for the mother and the offspring. We can also think about this in humans, right? Children throw temper tantrums. Okay, when they don't get what they want, often a young child will throw themselves to the floor and they will scream. Maybe they don't want to walk any further. Now, the child could be completely capable of walking further, but this behavior enables them to retain their own resources and extract resources from the mother. This child can clearly walk further, but has decided to exhibit a behavior that is beneficial to the individual. And this is often kind of, something along the lines of like carrying me, or, oh, I can't walk any further, etc., something along those lines. Okay. Effectively, what the offspring is doing here is they are acting like a younger individual. And this tricks the parents into giving them beneficial treatment, okay, through by kind of mimicking this younger behavior. Okay, they're acting younger than they actually are. So in all of those instances, the fitness of the individual is driving conflict within the family. But fitness can also lead to, and natural selection can also lead to individuals helping relatives in other circumstances. Of course, this is a selfish thing. So this is kind of this selfishly helping others, and we can think about this through the context of these R values as well. See, individuals share genes with their parents and siblings. We already said that. Parent offspring have an R value, relatedness coefficient of 0.5, siblings at 0.5, and self is 1. If the cost of helping isn't too great, a mutant gene for helpfulness may be selected for. If there isn't a great cost to helping the parents or their siblings, then they are in fact increasing the number of their genes in the next generation, because some of their genes are in parents and some of their genes are in siblings. This leads to a concept we call greater inclusive fitness. So if we look below, inclusive fitness is direct fitness plus indirect fitness. An individual's direct fitness is their fitness from their own reproduction, their own ability to survive, reproduce, and have offspring that do the same. Indirect fitness is fitness from reproductive relatives, discounted by their R value. So for siblings, that is 0.5. Every time a sibling produces offspring, that gives an increased indirect fitness to the individual who hasn't had the offspring, the relative that we're considering in a given moment. And that, therefore, is going to increase their inclusive fitness, direct fitness plus the indirect fitness. So if an individual can maximize their inclusive fitness, getting more of their genes into the next generation without too great a cost to their own fitness, then that's going to be beneficial to them. So when is it helpful? When is a helpful behavior advantageous? There's different factors to consider. What is the cost to the organism that is being helpful? What is the benefit to the recipient? Is it going to make a huge difference for that relative? And what is the coefficient of relatedness between those individuals? If W Inc. stands for inclusive fitness, okay, remember W is sometimes given as a measure of fitness, we can create this equation below, this model for inclusive fitness. WD here, this is the direct fitness for an individual. We need to minus the cost of the particular behavior. What is the cost of the organism to the organism? Are they risking their own survival, okay, by helping their sibling or helping their parent? What is the cost to them in terms of their fitness? Okay. But then we also need to consider in this, what is the benefit to the relative? What is the benefit to the relative? And of course, it could be that an individual is helping multiple relatives, which is why we have this sum of. So we're going to look at the sum of the change in fitness multiplied by the coefficient of relatedness. In other words, if an individual is helping a lot of their peers, then that's going to help. Okay, if they're going to help a lot of their family members, and it's going to make a big difference to their fitness and their close relatives, and there's a low cost to that help, well, then it's definitely going to be worth it. But if there is a big cost, it's not helping many of their relatives. Their relatives that it is helping maybe are only distantly related, and it's not making a big difference to them, well, then we would expect that behavior to be reduced. Therefore, it is best to help when the benefit to the recipient multiplied by the coefficient of relatedness minus the cost to the individual organism is greater than 0. This is Hamilton's rule. If this is the case, if benefit multiplied by coefficient of relatedness minus cost is greater than 0, we would expect the behavior to be selected for. Now, this is, of course, a really simplified model. We don't expect it to be correct all the time, but it is helpful when we think about behaviors that would be selected for. Okay. Here's a rather silly cartoon. We can see this alien here is trying to determine whether this second alien in the darker green top should help his friend to move house. Whether it is beneficial to him to move house. And the conclusion is, well, you're related, so you shouldn't reproduce together. You're closely related, but you can. It is actually beneficial by helping her. It's going to be beneficial to you to help her move house. Okay, this is kind of poking fun at this idea that we can just explain all behavior, all helping, like whether by how closely related individuals are. Okay, often when organisms are going out of their way to help another, they're not going to be sitting there doing some complicated long calculation. However, the underlying behaviors will be selected for or against based on how advantageous they are. I recommend taking a good look at that cartoon. One place where we see this in real life, this helping others, is in a phenomenon called helpers at the nest. In many bird species, over 220 bird species, the young adults stay with their parents and provide offspring for the new offspring of the parents. In other words, they're caring for their future siblings, but for the next generation of their siblings. Okay. So what's the benefit to these individuals to stay behind for a year and look after the next generation? Well, they're increasing the survival of their siblings, right? Their siblings are gaining in that way. And also, at the same time, it may be that the older offspring that are doing the helping, the helpers at the nest, they may be gaining some of the skills that they need for their own future childcare. But they're also increasing their inclusive fitness by benefiting their siblings. If the siblings share the same parents as that older sibling, if the younger sibling shares the same parents, then the R value is 0.5. However, if it's only a half sibling, then the R value is 0.25. Okay, which maybe then leads us to questions about, would we expect monogamous pairings of birds to would we see increased helpers at the nest in those circumstances? What are the costs for these individuals? Well, of course, if they are helping raise their younger siblings, then the opportunities for their own mating are going to be more limited. However, if those opportunities would naturally be minimal, seeing as they're only 1 year old, that might then be a minimal cost overall, and so might swing it in favor of helping for a year. So some data collection was done around some research was done around flycatchers, and over here we can see this is the age of the parents here versus their clutch size. We can see that more flycatchers produced had offspring when they were just 1 year old, and then we can see this is how many they had when they were. This is the clutch size when they were 2, when they were 3, and when they were 4 years old. Now, these individuals, we can see they had relatively small clutch sizes, okay, but that increased as they got more experienced, okay, until their clutch sizes reduced when they were 4 years old. Contrast that with this line up here. These are individuals who did not have offspring in their first year of life because they were acting as helpers at the nest. You can see that their clutch size in the second year was significantly higher than those individuals who had it in their first year, potentially as due to increased experience, maybe due to increased nutrition for themselves as well. When over the course of their lives, we can see that they produce a significant, every year that they have offspring, they produce significantly more eggs themselves. Okay, and so there is a real benefit to taking a year off to support their siblings. Over on this second graph, we've got a second experiment that was done in the same study. In this experiment, the red line here is individuals who were given extra eggs in their first year. So they laid a certain number of eggs, but then more eggs were added to their nest, and they didn't realize these are foreign eggs, and so they tried to raise them all. What we see is something that harks back to our previous lecture, that when an individual is really having to work very hard to look after all of these, that affects their future reproductive success. And we can see that those individuals that are given extra eggs in their first year then were not able to continue producing lots of eggs in future years. Those individuals who did not get extra eggs, our control group, found that in future years they were able to produce more eggs on their own without having any additional eggs added. Here's another example, and just a reminder of Hamilton's rule again. Between these things, the benefit, the coefficient of relatedness, and the cost. Okay, this needs to come out as greater than 0. So in this example, we'll be thinking about ground squirrels. So ground squirrels live in large colonies, and when predators approach the colony, the ground squirrels can call out to warn others of the approaching predator. However, there is a cost to calling out and warning others. In a study that was done, it was seen that 13% of callers would then be stalked by the predator, while only 5% of ones who stayed silent were stalked. So in other words, if an individual ground squirrel yells out, hey, there's a predator nearby, okay, makes an alarm call, that is an increased risk to that individual. What's the benefit? So that's the cost. What's the benefit? Well, the benefit is that calling out is going to aid their relatives, those around them, okay? Everyone around them is going to hear that alarm call, and when they aid relatives, that's going to increase their inclusive fitness. So what observations did these scientists make? Well, they noticed, first of all, that females tend to call more than males. Also, the females were more likely to call when they were physically nearer their relatives. If there was a lot of close relatives around them, they were much more likely to warn others of the danger than when they were surrounded by individuals that they were not closely related to. Another thing that was noted was that relatives tend to cooperate more than non-relatives for predator removal. It is actually possible for these ground squirrels to chase away these predators, things like stoats and weasels, etc. It's possible for them to chase them away, but it takes a large group of ground squirrels working together. They can't do it on their own. If they do it on their own, they're at risk. And what we see is more cooperation between more closely related individuals. In other words, we're seeing increased sacrificial behavior when relatives stand to benefit more than when non-relatives do. So this appears to be following Hamilton's rule. That then leads to an important question. Well, what about helping strangers? What about helping not necessarily strangers, but let's say non-relatives? What about helping non-relatives? Well, inclusive fitness, we've already said, okay, is this factor of direct fitness minus cost plus the benefits and the relatedness coefficient. By this, it would suggest that there's actually never an advantage in helping non-relatives. We should never help non-relatives because the R value is going to be 0, okay? Therefore, the cost is always going to be greater than the benefits if the R value, the relatedness coefficient is 0. So if individuals know they're unrelated, is it ever helpful behavior towards a stranger ever going to be selected for? Is it ever going to be selected for? Well, perhaps this equation is a little too simple. Maybe we need another set of values over on this side to consider. Maybe helping a non-relative could in turn result in benefits to self. So can altruism be separated from kin selection, which is what we've been talking about previously? Is it possible that individuals will return favors, even if they are non-relatives? So, and then following on from that, do we ever see altruism within populations? And the answer to that is, well, rarely. It is actually quite rare to see altruism in nature. One example that might be a little surprising to you is altruism. We can see altruism between vampire bats. Vampire bats will look after non-relatives. Vampire bats feed on blood, hence the name. Okay, as we can see a picture here of a vampire bat feeding on the foot of a chicken. That gives you an idea of their size. They can be quite small. Social groups of vampire bats roost together. And these social groups are a mixture of relatives and non-relatives. So we can study the association, that is how closely they roost together, and relatedness of vampire bat groups. 7% of the time when they go out to feed, vampire bats are unsuccessful at feeding. And that's an increased number for juveniles. About a third of the time, juveniles are unsuccessful in any given night at getting some food. If a vampire bat doesn't have food for 3 nights in a row, they will die. It's fatal. But what we see between vampire bats is blood-sharing behavior. When they return to the roost, vampire bats will sometimes vomit up a little bit of blood to feed some of their neighbors. So in 1984, Wilkinson did a study on this, and they observed, Wilkinson and his team observed 110 blood-sharing events, so 110 times when bats regurgitated blood. 77 of those 110 blood-sharing events were parents feeding their offspring. Okay, and that helps to account for some of this, how do these bats survive if some of the youngsters are only being unsuccessful 33% of the time. Of the remaining 33 cases, 21 of those, the researchers knew the R coefficient and the association of the pair. They knew how closely related they were, and they knew how much time they spent together in their roosting. And using some fancy statistical techniques that I won't go into here, they were able to establish that both relatedness and degree of association independently contribute to sharing. So here we can see This is the association of all the individuals within a particular group as they roost together, how much time they spend together. And this would be, if it was random, this would be the association linking to blood sharing. What we can see with the regurgitators, though, is those that regurgitate tend to regurgitate towards those, with those, and provide blood for those who they tend to associate with. In other words, if a pair of bats roost together frequently, then they're much more likely to share blood with one another. On the other side over here, we have relatedness. This is how related all of the different bats are, and if they were randomly sharing their blood with the people around them, the individuals around them, we would see a distribution something like this. When in fact what happens is when individuals are more closely related, they also share blood more with one another. It's important to say that these are both contributing independently, and their statistical tests show this. So this is an example of reciprocal altruism. Reciprocal altruism is when one individual helps another with the expectation that in the future they themselves would be helped. We see this a lot in different species, such as in primates, cleaning each other's fur. That is another example of reciprocal altruism. One of the most extreme versions of cooperation is eusociality. So eusociality is when organisms work together to cooperatively take care of young and, most significantly, divide up their reproductive labor so that only a few individuals do the job of reproducing. One thing that is characteristic of eusocial populations is they have overlapping generations where offspring are aiding their parents to create more siblings. So some examples of this, of course, bees and other insects, the Hymenoptera in particular, are eusocial, where they have a few queens or just a single queen that's doing most of the reproducing. We also see this eusociality in snapping shrimp. Really fascinating example. I encourage you to look those up. They are the only eusocial organisms that live in the sea. And there's even mammals such as the naked, it says naked mole rates. It should be naked mole rats. They are also able to, they also carry out eusocial behavior. So where does this come from? Well, an old theory to do with this is haploid-diploidy. Bees and a lot of other Hymenoptera species determine sex of an individual based on whether they are haploid or diploid. Male bees are haploid. That means they only have half the normal number of chromosomes. Instead of having, say, an X and Y chromosome like humans do, they literally just have half of all of the chromosomes. The mother has 2 sets of chromosomes. All females have 2 sets of chromosomes. So a father will pass on his full set of chromosomes to every one of his daughters, and they will all get the same full set of chromosomes as the father, plus half of the chromosomes from their mother. Brothers will just get half of the chromosomes from the mother. This means that while each parent has a 0.5 R value with their offspring, they share half of the genes with their offspring, it means that sisters are more closely related than typical siblings are, as any genes from the father are shared by all of the siblings, all of the sisters. In other words, their R value is 0.75. They are 3 times more closely related to one another than they are to their brothers, to which their R value is 0.25. They are less closely related than typical siblings. They only share approximately a quarter of the genes. That also means that the sisters are more closely related to one another than they are to their parents, creating a benefit to the sisters for producing more sisters, okay, and helping, therefore, their parents produce more offspring. Sisters are more closely related to each other than their own offspring, so raising more sisters is actually better than their own reproduction in terms of maximizing their fitness and their inclusive fitness. So there is a difference between the ideal ratios of offspring sex for the queen and for the workers. The worker's ideal sex ratio for a hive is going to be 3 females to 1 male, reflecting the coefficient of relatedness. The queen's ideal sex ratio of a hive would be 1 female to 1 male, because she has the same coefficient of relatedness to the female offspring as to the male offspring. So what is the outcome of this conflict? Do we end up with more females in the hive, or do we end up with a 1-to-1 ratio? Well, it actually depends on the hive. Sex ratios of ant species follow a similar pattern, and this is a study that was done on them. In a hive of ants, where there was in a colony of ants, when there is a monogynous single queen colony, when there's only one queen present, it is optimal for the workers to maintain this 3-to-1 ratio. And what we can see is that is what we get. The queen has only, the queen for whom a 1-to-1 ratio would be optimal, is not getting her increased fitness. In a polygynous colony where there are multiple queens, the siblings, the sisters, are no longer as closely related to one another. And so in that instance, we see a 1-to-1 ratio of male to female ants. In other words, this benefit of how closely related they are goes away. Interestingly, with ants, ant colonies also sometimes have slave maker colonies. These are colonies of ants that go out and they recruit other ants to be their slaves and to work in their colony. In these new colonies, again, there isn't a significant relatedness between individuals, okay? And so we see this 1-to-1 ratio. So as you can see, the 1-to-1 ratio is present in the slave maker colonies, the polygynous colonies where there's multiple queens, but there is a 3-to-1 ratio. It's closer to a 3-to-1 ratio when there's a single queen. So what can we conclude? It's actually the workers that control the sex ratio of the colonies. It's not really the queen. Okay, we tend to think of the queen as ruling over the entire colony. That is not the case. Really, the workers are controlling the queen. If anything, she is the slave of the workers, producing the optimal fitness ratio for the workers in the colony. Haploid diploidy isn't the only cause of eusocial behavior, though. We know this because there's several eusocial behavior species that don't have haplodiploidy. Multiple queens or fathers are common, and so that cannot be the only thing that explains why some species show eusocial behavior, form these supercolonies where only a few individuals breed together. More recent alternative theory is that complex nesting behavior, niches that require complex nesting behavior, and in particular very helpless larvae, is more closely correlated with eusociality. If they're producing helpless offspring, then a group has to work together in order to produce, to be successful and to increase their inclusive fitness. So what are our conclusions? Fitness can lead to conflict or cooperation with families. In most cases, both categories can be explained using increased inclusive fitness. Each individual is trying to maximize their fitness by either going through conflict with their families or cooperating. Not all behavior can, however, be explained by the cost and coefficient of relatedness, as we saw with the vampire bats. Altruism in nature is rare, but there are examples of reciprocal altruism amongst animal species. Something to think about for next lesson is why don't more organisms collaborate if it tends to be better for all involved? We'll be talking about game theory and how cheetahs ruin it for everybody in that next session. Until then, goodbye.